Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening.
Roxanne headed straight to Grant's room after arriving at the hotel. She had made preparations, thinking of the terms and other potential requests they may make. However, Roxanne was slightly surprised when Grant opened the door. "Is this man standing in front of me truly my father?" He was slightly thinner than he was 6 years ago. His face was no longer as ruddy as it had once been. His skin was drier and had a slightly waxy sheen, and wrinkles filled his forehead. His hair was cut short too. Perhaps he had gotten it cut because his hair had begun to go white.
Roxanne?
Grant revealed a slightly excited look in his eyes. They had not seen each other for many years. Thus, she did not know if it was an act or if those were his true emotions. Nevertheless, his gaze was somewhat timid. Then, he looked at Lucian and nodded.
"Mr. Farwell."
"Hello, Mr. Jarvis." Lucian was indifferent. He barely spared the other man a glance before turning back to look at his wife. Roxanne calmed down a little after seeing her father's humble attitude. Just then, Winnie came over and stared at Roxanne in astonishment. She was surprised by the latter's clothing. Roxanne's attire was very elegant, and it made Winnie somewhat embarrassed and jealous. However, she immediately put on an elated expression. "Roxanne, it really is you. You've changed so much. You look very graceful. I'm sorry your father and I have been traveling so much that we've just found out about your wedding. We came as soon as possible." Winnie nudged Grant. "Why are you standing at the door? Hurry and invite your daughter and son-in-law in." Inwardly, Roxanne applauded Winnie's instant change in expression. The latter was clearly an expert at this. She also spoke as if they had a very close relationship. However, Roxanne did not forget the life she endured at the Jarvis residence after her mother passed away. Her mother had just passed away for a year when her father had brought Winnie along with her children, Joseph and Juliana. From that moment onward, Roxanne realized that her father's betrayal of her mother was not something that had begun recently. She and Joseph were only 2 years apart, while she was 3 years older than Juliana. Although Roxanne was older than both of them, the younger siblings did not consider her their older sister. They showed her no respect, often mocking and playing tricks on her. Back then, Winnie was a stepmother who did nothing for her. She never bought Roxanne new clothes. Whenever they had treats, she would always put them away for her own children. Eventually, it escalated to Winnie refusing to allocate funds for Roxanne to continue her studies at university. Thankfully, Roxanne was able to meet a good mentor when studying medicine. Relying on her medical skills, she treated some people and managed to scrape together enough to pay for her tuition fee. Eventually, Grant opened his own factory and became wealthy. However, Roxanne only grew unhappier by the day. In the end, Roxanne was sent to the Farwell family to get married to Lucian in order to appease Ethan. Then, if Roxanne had not been in love with Lucian for a long time, she would not have agreed to it. When she thought of everything that happened in the past, she found it difficult to eliminate the anger and indignation she felt in her heart. Honestly speaking, she did not care about Grant's humble behavior. Thoughts of cutting ties with them were always in her mind. "Mrs. Jarvis, I'd appreciate it if you didn't address us with such familiarity. After all, I'm not your biological daughter. You've made that fact very clear." Roxanne utterly rejected Winnie's familiar form of address. Roxanne's words caused Winnie's expression to stiffen. Forcing a smile, Winnie said, That's right. I've overstepped my bounds. Come on inside and have a seat. I may have been a tad overexcited because you're getting married tomorrow." Lucian sighed to himself when he saw how fast Winnie switched gears. What a shameless woman. Nodding, Grant opened the door wider. Upon entering the room, Roxanne and Lucian saw 2 sets of formal clothes neatly arranged on the couch. It was obvious that Grant and Winnie had prepared the clothes for tomorrow. "Where are the children?" "I'm such a terrible grandfather." Grant was extra attentive. He hurriedly poured them drinks and carefully carried the glasses over. Following that, he turned around and went into the other room. Winnie stared at Roxanne enviously. She was jealous of the confident way the latter carried herself. If we're talking about family connections, it's obvious that my daughter, Juliana, is more superior. She also has plenty of wealthy friends. I just don't understand why she's still a lowly tour guide and remains single. On the other hand, Joseph dated a well-to-do lady before, but their relationship did not work out. The more Winnie thought about it, the more intense her jealousy became. Despite that, she kept her emotions in check and maintained a pleasant smile on her face. Soon, Grant came out of the room with several sets of clothing in his arms. I feel bad that I can't afford more expensive clothing, but I hope you'll accept these gifts for the children. He came to a stop before Roxanne. Furrowing her brows, Roxanne refused to accept the proffered gifts. Lucian's expression grew a tad chilly. These look a bit too small. Children tend to grow fast. I don't think they will fit them. Grant stood there awkwardly, at a loss for what to do. Winnie went over to Grant and chided, I told you. Kids these days tend to grow quickly. You refused to listen when I told you to get a size larger. It's all right. We can return these and get a larger size. With that, she took the 3 sets of clothes away. Roxanne, I came back in a hurry, so I don't have much money on hand. I also don't know how to provide you with a dowry. I'm really a failure of a father. Grant scratched his head embarrassedly. Roxanne, your father owed a lot of money that he couldn't pay back after his factory went bankrupt. These few years have been very difficult for us as we have to go into hiding. Your siblings aren't doing well either. Perhaps it is our fate, Winnie added in a tearful tone. The atmosphere was heavy. If it had been anyone else, perhaps they would already been deceived by Grant and Winnie. However, Roxanne's resolve remained firm. She gave Lucian a look, indicating for him to ignore them. Following that, she replied coldly, I never got to enjoy the fruit when the factory was doing well then. Didn't the business fail because you were too prideful? Roxanne did not intend to let her father and stepmother off easily. In fact, she was well aware of their personalities more than anyone else. Hearing that, Grant and Winnie could no longer maintain the facade. Grant trembled slightly as he frowned. His voice was hard as he said, Roxanne, you're about to get married soon. As your father, I rushed over in order to attend your wedding. You don't have to behave so repulsively. If you think I'm being an eyesore, I will leave immediately. Grant, how can you say that? Oh, why are you so stubborn? Winnie hurriedly tugged the former's shirt. Smiling awkwardly, she added, Roxanne's right. We were too prideful back then. We fell into debt because we were too vain. Roxanne, please don't be mad. Your father and I will leave immediately after attending your wedding ceremony. We won't cause you any trouble. Roxanne did not believe a single word that came out of their mouths. Why are they pretending to act so humble? Did they forget how they treated me all those years ago? They've never thought of me as their daughter for over 10 years. Now they are trying to act pitiful and trying to guilt-trip me. Anyway, it doesn't matter what they do. I refuse to let them be part of my life. And no need to fret, I comprehend entirely. You don't have to attend the wedding ceremony. Roxanne said the words without holding back. She had no intention of showing Winnie any respect. Winnie was stunned when she heard the words. Grant's expression darkened as he began to tremble as he tried to suppress the anger in him. Roxanne is a completely different person now. I thought we'd be able to win her sympathy if we acted pitiful and miserable, but it looks like she's turned into a cold-hearted woman. In that case, we will not be attending the wedding ceremony. There's also no need for us to remain here and hold up your preparations. We'll take our leave now. Grant stole a glance at Lucian to gauge his reaction. The man was completely unfazed. He showed no reaction and made no attempt to smooth things over. Gritting his teeth in determination, Grant shot Roxanne another angry look before turning around and wanted to walk into the room to pack his things. Winnie seethed. Roxanne has matured. She's no longer the pushover she once was. However, she refused to let the opportunity slip through her hands. Thus, she decided to back away a little and hastened to persuade Roxanne with a smile. Roxanne, I don't mind if you don't consider me your stepmother, but Grant is your father. I'm sure your mother would not wish for this. How can you not have your family with you on such a big day? What will people say if your own father doesn't attend the wedding ceremony? Lucian loathed to admit it, but Winnie really had a way with her words. He even found himself unable to refute her statement. It was true that getting married was a major event in life, and there would be no one who did not want his or her parents' approval and blessing. Winnie, forget it. My capable daughter looks down on the Jarvis family and thinks of us as a burden. We might as well make ourselves scarce, Grant declared coldly. Following that, he went into the room and began packing his things. Roxanne was surprised. They're quite good at acting. I can't believe I'm actually moved by their performance. She had been feeling calm throughout the entire conversation before Winnie brought up her mother. Irritated, Roxanne stared at Winnie and said coldly, Mrs. Jarvis, how dare you bring up my mother? Did you forget how you married my father? Honestly, I've given you more than you deserve by standing here and speaking to you. How dare the homewrecker who shamelessly barged into my family put up an act and play the victim? Winnie was completely dumbfounded. Flushing, she nearly revealed her true colors. However, she was unable to do so as Lucian was still present. She could only continue to hold it in despite the urge to claw Roxanne's mouth growing stronger. Still, the fury in Roxanne's heart was far more intense. In the last 2 years of her life, her mother had been depressed until she finally succumbed to a terminal illness. Roxanne had always thought that it had something to do with Winnie. Fine. We got it. We're leaving right away. In the end, Winnie dared not speak further. She picked up the clothes they had gotten for the 3 children from the couch and went into the room to help Grant pack their things. With that, Roxanne and Lucian no longer had a reason to remain in the room. They turned around to leave. They hadn't gone far when they heard Grant and Winnie break into an argument behind them. 6 years ago, Grant had not shown up at the wedding ceremony after getting his hands on the money. At that moment, he wanted to attend the wedding ceremony because he was trying to get out of his predicament. Roxanne believed that his motive was only to get money all along. Roxanne felt cathartic after dealing with Winnie and letting out the pent-up frustration and anger she had kept bottled in for over a decade. Once they returned to the mansion, Roxanne made a phone call to Sonia and personally informed the latter that she had utterly cut her ties with Grant and that she did not wish for him to attend the wedding ceremony. Also, there was no longer any need to entertain Grant and Winnie any further. Sonia felt relieved after she heard that her daughter-in-law had managed to settle her affairs. She comforted Roxanne, assuring her that she would no longer be bullied now that she had the Farwell family at her back. The two of them chatted for a while longer. Once again, Sonia apologized profusely for the things that had happened before. Roxanne had long since let the matter go. Roxanne, I made countless mistakes because I was a prejudiced and arrogant fool. After the wedding tomorrow, we'll truly be a family. I hope you'll put the past behind us and give me the opportunity to be a good mother-in-law and a good grandmother for the kids. Roxanne had not expected Sonia to reflect so deeply on her own actions. Mom, we need to constantly move on in life. I hope you'll forgive any mistakes I make in the future. She believed that Sonia had spoken from the bottom of her heart, so she too truly meant what she said. All right. You should go get some rest as the preparations for a traditional wedding ceremony begins at 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning. Roxanne sat on the couch in a daze after hanging up. Upon seeing her reaction, Lucian asked, what's on your mind? Are you thinking about your mother? He had hit the bullseye. Roxanne was trying to recall memories of her mother. She had been very young back then, roughly 4 to 5 years old. In her memories, Her mother was always smiling. She wore a sweet expression, and her face was always filled with tenderness. Her mother was a wonderful person, and yet she was utterly destroyed in the end. Everything happened because Grant betrayed his family. Perhaps Winnie had even incited him on purpose. Hence, Roxanne's hatred toward Winnie had never abated even after more than 10 years. She decided to study medicine after witnessing how tormented her mother's last moments were. "Darling, there's something I've never told you," Lucian suddenly said. "What is it?" Roxanne snapped out of her thoughts. Lucian smiled faintly. "I've always gone to your mother's grave to pay my respects to her on the anniversary of her death after we got married the first time. Though I always went alone and no one else knows about it. I guessed that it was you, but I couldn't believe it." Roxanne's mood improved greatly after hearing his confession. While Roxanne had been at Epia and unable to return, she had entrusted Madeline to visit her mother's grave on her behalf each year and watch the process remotely. Each time, she noticed a bouquet of flowers was already placed at her mother's grave. Madeline had suggested that it was the cemetery's caretaker who had arranged for the flowers. Roxanne could hardly believe that her suspicion was finally confirmed. It really was Lucian. "Indeed, I was the one. I stood there and begged her to let me see you again." Lucian wore a begrudging expression, likely feeling that his actions did not fit with his image as a cold and aloof CEO. Roxanne's smile deepened. "I never expected Lucian to do something like this. Mom must have watched over us and let us reunite through the 3 children. I believe she's always watching over me." With this thought in mind, Roxanne felt calmer. "Mom is always supporting me and on my side. Who cares about what Grant and Winnie say?" The joyous and lively ambience of a traditional wedding was unparalleled and could not be matched by any other modern wedding. At 3:30 in the morning, Roxanne was already dressed in a classic wedding gown with her face adorned with light makeup. Despite the veil obstructing her view, Roxanne's excitement was palpable as she eagerly awaited Lucian to lift her veil. Close relatives of the Farwell family had come to lend a hand, filling the multi-story manor with the sounds of cheerful conversation and laughter. The 3 little children were playing and chasing each other before running into Roxanne's room. While Archie and Benny donned festive traditional outfits, Estella wore a beautiful traditional gown. They were chattering excitedly in front of Roxanne. "Mommy, your wedding gown is so pretty. Can I take a look at your face?" Estella asked out of curiosity. Archie interjected, "No. We cannot remove the veil. Only Daddy can do that." "Yeah. A traditional wedding has a lot of rituals and ceremonies. That's why it's festive and fun." Benny chimed in. The children, fascinated by the various items used in the rituals, began studying them intently. When the moment finally arrived, a few female masters of ceremonies went in to escort Roxanne out of the room. They helped her up the wedding carriage and headed straight to the manor. Starting from the manor, they followed each ritual step by step according to the set schedule. After stepping out of the carriage, Roxanne entered the manor and was greeted by Lucian. They then exchanged wedding rings, recited the wedding vows, and sealed the deal with a kiss. "Let's have a toast," someone exclaimed, hoping to further liven up the atmosphere. Time to lead the newlyweds to their room. The professional masters of ceremonies announced. Every ritual was accompanied by heartfelt blessings, joyful cheers, and thunderous applause from the growing number of relatives and friends who had gathered to witness the wedding. Lucian could no longer suppress his emotions upon noticing the veil. "Despite having been through it once before, why am I still feeling nervous on my wedding day?" Meanwhile, Roxanne remained still, but her heart was filled with anticipation. She felt the moment Lucian lifted her veil would mark the beginning of their life together forever. Finally, Lucian carefully lifted the veil. As their eyes met, both of them could not help but giggle bashfully. Their gentle gazes locked as they met each other's eyes. "We've finally completed the rituals," Lucian exclaimed, looking at Roxanne, who was still adorned in her wedding gown, her beauty taking his breath away. "Yes. The ceremony's finally over. From now on, I'll be your wife forever." Roxanne could not help but feel emotional, her eyes rippling with waves of emotion. Eventually, she fell into the man's embrace as he reached out to hug her. Yet, it was not the right time to consummate their marriage, as they had another modern-style wedding to attend in the afternoon. Following the master of ceremonies requirements, the newlyweds had to stay in the room for a while. The traditional wedding finally ended when Elias and Sonia, as the elders of the family, completed the remaining ceremonies. With that, the banquet began promptly. A limited amount of alcohol was served at the event to ensure guests would not overindulge and be unable to attend the modern wedding in the afternoon. The newlyweds, the 3 young children along with their grandparents, were seated at the main table alongside Jonathan, James, Madeline, and Lorraine. They deliberately left a seat vacant to display the bracelet Roxanne had treasured for many years. That bracelet was a gift from her mother, and placing it on the table was a way to symbolize her mother's presence at the wedding. Roxanne looked around and glanced at Madeline, her in-laws, her husband, and her children before turning her attention to the bracelet. Her eyes instantly filled with tears of happiness that she could not hold back. More guests were invited to the modern wedding in the afternoon, as the open field in the manor was much larger than a soccer field. Countless luxury cars of the world's top brands arrived one after another. The venue was adorned with enchanting decors complete with the ethereal allure of dry ice, which wafted gently to create a whimsical and otherworldly ambience. Each guest who attended the wedding had an extraordinary background and came from all over the world. When Roxanne appeared in her wedding gown, all the socialites and ladies from the higher echelons of society were in awe of her beauty. They all felt that only Roxanne was worthy of Lucian. Taking in her appearance, image, temperament, or ability, everything matched perfectly. Naturally, the wedding was not without its share of surprises. Archie and Benny made a grand entrance by arriving in a hot air balloon, accompanied by security personnel, and showering petals onto the ground below. Meanwhile, Estella descended safely from a zipline in her traditional dress, appearing like a magical fairy. She then handed Lucian and Roxanne a pair of rings. In front of a larger crowd, they once again recited their vows before the priest and exchanged their wedding rings. Lucian then gently kissed his wife's forehead. He opted to forego the toast that was supposed to follow the ceremony, as he was concerned that Roxanne might be weary and in need of rest. After all, she had been awake since 3 in the morning. In the end, Elias and Sonia represented the newlyweds to entertain the guests for the rest of the afternoon. At the wedding, a tacit agreement seemed to have been reached among all the guests, as no one took pictures during the ceremony. It was widely acknowledged that doing so would have breached the expected decorum for such a dignified event. Therefore, not a single photo leaked from the entire event. The news of Lucian and Roxanne's wedding did not surface on the internet until evening, but when it did, it quickly made headlines on major websites. Countless netizens began actively discussing the newlyweds. Of course, it also inevitably sparked a controversy. While some regarded Lucian and Roxanne as a match made in heaven, others felt that Roxanne was not as competent as some had claimed. They also opined that her reputation as a miracle doctor, combined with her various investments, might not be entirely genuine. Nevertheless, Lucian and Roxanne chose to ignore the criticism and smiled, allowing others to say what they wished. While some were pleased with the turn of events, some were not. Christina, who was on a luxury cruise heading back to Horan, was hopping mad when she learned that it was Roxanne's wedding day. She gritted her teeth, and a sharp glint flashed across her eyes. In a shabby rented apartment in Horrington, Winnie gave the drunken Grant an earful, and soon, an argument erupted between them. Meanwhile, Sean from the Crawford family was not invited to the wedding. His cousin, Jonas Crawford, took his place at the ceremony. An opportunity finally came knocking on Jonas' door. "It's time for me to take Lucian on." After the ceremony, Roxanne slept for a couple of hours. When she woke up and walked to the living hall, she noticed the banquet in the open field was nearing its end. Madeline, with a flushed face and eyes slightly glazed from alcohol, got up to her. "I almost forgot. I promised to give you a big gift." Madeline's speech was noticeably slower than usual. Noticing her unsteady state, Roxanne quickly helped her up to prevent her from collapsing. She did forget the gift that Madeline had promised her. What could it be? Madeline rummaged through her bag and fished something out of it. It was a copy of the house deed. Roxanne knitted her brows. Don't tell me you're going to give me a house. I don't need another house. Look, we already have this big manor. Madeline waved her hand dismissively, gave her the house deed, and grinned. You're right. I'm giving you a house. You gave me a mansion, so in return, I'm giving you another property. Don't worry, my salary as the director is quite substantial, and my mother has also contributed some money as well, so we bought it for you. Roxanne wondered why her best friend would go to such great lengths to buy her a property. There must be something special about the house. With that, she went through the house deed and looked at the address. Instantly, she was stunned. Isn't this the old house my mom and I used to live in when I was a child? Many years ago, her father, Grant Jarvis, sold the house for a mansion. Roxanne looked up at her best friend, her eyes filled with excitement. Madeline, how thoughtful of you to do this for me. I can't believe you bought it back. Thank you so much. I knew you would like it.
Madeline chuckled.
Suddenly, her eyelids grew heavier, and she nearly fell over. Out of nowhere, a figure appeared quickly and caught her just in time. Take care of her for me, Jonathan. Roxanne smiled. After keeping the house deed, she left the living hall and went to look for her husband. Following the wedding, the entire family moved in permanently to the manor, including Elias and Sonia, who had been residing in the Farwell main residence. The decision was made by the two to relocate to make it easier to take care of the 3 children. Meanwhile, Peregrine went as far as insisting that Roxanne take a 1-week wedding leave to allow herself to relax at home. Originally, Lucian planned to have their honeymoon right away, but with the upcoming peak holiday season, he was worried about the massive crowd. Therefore, Roxanne persuaded him to postpone it. It was a beautiful day with fantastic weather. The children were having a blast in the backyard, sweating profusely on the small football field. Estella, despite being a girl, loved to learn everything from Archie and Benny, and her dribbling skills looked quite flawless. Meanwhile, Lucian and Roxanne had set up a picnic blanket near the small lake and filled it with a variety of food, including barbecue steak, vegetable salad, fruits, and snacks. Lucian had even brought along a camping coffee pot and proceeded to light up the alcohol burner to begin the process of making coffee. As the high-quality Yirgacheffe coffee dissolved in hot water, its unique fragrance instantly filled the air. It had a scent of peanut brittle and the aroma of osmanthus at the same time. Lucian brewed just enough coffee for 2 small couple mugs. Then, he carefully handed one to his wife. Take a sniff first. Don't rush to drink it. It's still quite hot. Lucian's face showed more tenderness compared to before. Roxanne accepted the mug, and a happy smile spread across her face. The aroma of the coffee was indeed excellent. Roxanne blew on it to cool it down and took a sip to taste it. She instantly tasted the fragrance and felt it penetrate her nostrils. The coffee was slightly bitter with a hint of sourness, but she could sense a sweet aftertaste. When she took a sip of plain water after that, she noticed that the water had somehow turned sweet. Roxanne had grown to love these cozy moments dearly. She beckoned the children to come and drink some water to stay hydrated. Not long after, the children grew tired from playing and became hungry. They started digging into the food. Before long, Elias and Sonia arrived to join them. They had even brought an outdoor tea set and began to sip tea while chatting. As they were family, they could freely discuss anything and express their emotions without the need to conceal anything. Roxanne, did Grant and Winnie come to bother you again? Sonia asked. Roxanne shook her head. No, I figured they're probably too embarrassed to bother me, and I doubt they have the courage. Mom, I'm part of the Farwell family now. They wouldn't dare. You're right. If they try to harm or bully you, don't hesitate to let us know, please, Sonia reassured her. Roxanne nodded earnestly. Unfortunately, Leisure time always seemed to pass too quickly. In the blink of an eye and amid harmonious conversations, the evening had already arrived. As Lucian and Roxanne were packing up their outdoor equipment, Roxanne's phone suddenly rang. Roxanne checked the caller ID, and it was a stranger's number. She frowned at it and answered. "I must congratulate you, Roxanne, for marrying into such a prestigious family. However, how could you treat my mother so disrespectfully? Who do you think you are? Do you think you can trample on someone else's dignity just because you have money now? Listen, don't let me catch you. Otherwise, I'll teach you a lesson anytime," the caller said. The voice was so familiar that Roxanne couldn't forget it for the rest of her life. Instantly, a hint of anger appeared on Roxanne's face. She coldly rebuked, "Juliana, you never grow up. Do you think this is still 10 years ago?" The person on the other side of the phone was at a loss for words. After some time, Juliana continued, "So what if you're living a good life now? The fact that none of your family attended the wedding made you a laughingstock. Roxanne, how could someone like you deserve happiness?" Roxanne had intended to argue back at Juliana, but as she looked at the children running and playing around, something inside her suddenly calmed down, and her anger dissipated. "It appears that I don't need to respond to challenges from people I don't like." Therefore, Roxanne put on a composed tone and responded, I don't see how you could consider you people to be a part of my family. Whether I'm happy or not has nothing to do with you. Please refrain from bothering me in the future." With that, Roxanne hung up right away. After packing the picnic blanket, Lucian turned and asked, "Was that Juliana?" Roxanne nodded, and a small smile appeared on her lips. "Don't worry. I can handle her. She no longer has any power to bully me." "Okay." As matter of fact, Lucian wasn't worried. After all, his wife's state of mind had changed completely. Roxanne's individual abilities were strong enough to make her powerful, even without the backup of the Farwell family. After packing everything up and returning to the manor's living room, Roxanne noticed Sonia and the chefs were busy preparing dinner and decided to lend a hand in the kitchen. Meanwhile, Archie and Benny were chatting with Lucian about the interesting things that happened at school. Estella, on the other hand, was preoccupied with designing a gown. Not long after dinner, James suddenly arrived at the manor in a hurry. Lucian's heart sank as he saw the anxiousness on James' face, and he quickly asked what had happened. James looked crestfallen and dejected. Seeing that there were no outsiders around, he decided to speak up. "Lucian, my mother's hysteria has been getting worse lately. She's been displaying violent behavior, and I don't know what to do anymore. I came here to ask Roxanne if she knows of any way to help my mother." James explained. After hearing James' explanation, Roxanne and Lucian exchanged surprised glances. They were surprised because they had never heard James mention anything about his mother having hysteria. Even Elias and Sonia rushed over to ask about the condition of James' mother, Jennifer Thompson. "What do you mean? Why didn't you tell us about your mother's hysteria before?" Elias asked, his expression turning angry as he realized he was not aware of the situation. "It seems like you and your father have been keeping this from us for years. Why would you hide something like this?" James stayed silent, but his lack of response was an admission in itself. Afterward, James gave a brief explanation about the illness Jennifer had been suffering from all these years. Hysteria was often regarded as a mental illness, as it was a mental disorder that usually occurred when someone experienced significant emotional trauma. The symptoms of hysteria often include dissociative and adjustment disorders. During a dissociative state, individuals may experience a sense of losing their identity and had severe doubts and unclear speculations about themselves. In other words, they didn't know who they were. On the other hand, during an adjustment state, an individual's temperament may suddenly change, appearing entirely different from their typical self. My mother's illness manifested about a decade ago. We managed to keep it in check through therapy and medication, and she was able to lead a fairly normal life. At one point, we even thought that she had fully recovered. Unfortunately, during a recent trip to Allender with my parents, something unexpected happened and triggered my mother's illness and made it uncontrollable again." Lucian could feel his heart lurched. No wonder James looked weird when we picked him up at the airport that day. Roxanne was also taken aback by the news. It reminded her of Lucian's previous comment that he never expected James to become a psychologist. It seemed that the root of his choice was his mother. Perhaps he became a psychologist because of his mother's illness. What exactly happened in Allender? Sonia pressed on with her questioning. Everyone was curious about the kind of severe trauma that would trigger Yennefer's mental disorder. James' expression suddenly became gloomy, and he started blinking rapidly as if trying to avoid recalling the events of that time. After hesitating for a few seconds, he finally decided to tell the truth. I killed someone." Everyone at the scene was shocked after hearing that. Since Sonia and Roxanne were both women, they took some time to process the information and remained stunned for a while. On the other hand, Elias was quick to snap out of it and immediately asked for clarification. Please explain everything clearly. Under what circumstances did you have to make such a decision? It must have been a dangerous situation, right? If you had killed someone maliciously, would you even be able to come back now?" His words were actually directed at Sonia and Roxanne. Sonia and Roxanne snapped out of their daze and turned their attention to James, anticipating his response. Yes, it was a robbery. My parents and I were on a trip to the grasslands to see wildlife when we were robbed by some local thugs. We cooperated and gave them all our money. However, the leader of the thugs wanted to kidnap my mother. So, in a desperate situation, I had to use my gun. As James recounted the events, Sonia and Roxanne didn't display the same look of shock as before, but they felt a sense of unease for the family. Allender was a place of chaos and housed many unforeseen dangers. Due to the safety issues of the country, people were allowed to bear arms. Therefore, it was permissible for James to carry firearm at that time because it was a means of self-protection against the extremely ferocious wild animals in the grasslands in the event of an uncontrollable situation. Little did he expect that this trip would result in a situation where he had to take a life in self-defense. The happenings at the time instantly shocked Yennefer, and her hysteria began to take over due to fear, causing her to speak incoherently. Finally, the local authorities arrested the thugs and quickly took Yennefer to the hospital for emergency treatment. However, the hospital at that time did not even meet basic hygiene standards, let alone equipped with any facilities for mental treatment. Fortunately, James, being a psychologist, was able to use hypnosis to induce sleep in Yennefer, and his father, Jones, promptly took Yennefer out of Allender. After my mother returned, I invited all the well-known psychological experts I knew to our house. The treatment process lasted for more than half a month. Meanwhile, I was trapped in Allender dealing with the whole thing and was only released afterward. When I returned home, I worried that if my mother saw me, she would remember the scene of me firing the gun. So, I lied to Lucian and didn't go home directly. After James finished speaking, Lucian felt a surge of anger in his heart. Hence, he cast a cold glance at James. How could you try to hide such a serious incident from me? You're really foolish." James didn't dare to argue with Lucian, and his face was full of apologies. Of course, Lucian wouldn't really blame him. He immediately looked at Roxanne. "I understand. You are aware of the urgent situation at home, but you're uncertain whether Mrs. Lon would become more agitated upon seeing you. Therefore, are you considering letting me try instead?" Roxanne looked at James, waiting for his confirmation. James nodded. His eyes were full of hope. "I can do that without any problem. Lucian and I will go to your house to check things out now. You don't have to worry too much. You've mentioned that there are plenty of psychology experts at your house, so it shouldn't be a big problem," Roxanne reassured after agreeing to help James without hesitation. Lucian also stood up, approached James, and patted him on the shoulder. "You learned this from Jonathan, didn't you? I'll forgive you this time, but I don't want the same thing to happen again in the future," Lucian warned in a serious tone. James pulled the corners of his mouth into a wry smile and nodded. Okay, I'll take note." Since there was no time to lose, they immediately headed toward James' house. James drove, and after half an hour of speeding, they arrived at the Lon family's mansion. The car pulled up at the front door, and James didn't plan to go in with them. "I don't think it's appropriate for me to appear right now. I'm counting on you, Lucian, Roxanne." The couple gave him a reassuring look and quickly walked into the mansion. Since they had informed Jones beforehand, the latter was waiting to greet them by the door. He immediately stepped forward when he noticed Roxanne and Lucian. Lucian, is this Roxanne?" Jones looked at Roxanne and then apologized. "I'm really sorry I couldn't attend your wedding." Please don't worry about it, Mr. Lon. After all, there are some special circumstances at home," Roxanne replied, having learned to treat those with close relationships with the Farwell family as close acquaintances. They noticed Jones' gaze directed toward the outside. Lucian quickly explained, "James won't be coming in for now. He's worried that Mrs. Lon may be triggered if she sees him. But don't worry, he's fine." The worries on Jones' face subsided slowly after hearing Lucian's assurance. He gave a nod and commented, "Lucian, you're very caring. I'm genuinely concerned that my son is being too hard on himself. In reality, all of this was simply an unexpected event. Please help me in advising him." Upon entering the hall, they were greeted by the sight of many psychologists engaging in a lively discussion. Leading the group was Robert Zucker, a renowned psychologist in the country and the mentor who guided James into the field of psychology. Roxanne had heard her mentor mention Robert before. The man had been researching psychology for more than 30 years and had written many books on the subject, including one on criminal psychology that had become a textbook for the police. This time, Robert brought along several students with him. Not only was he treating Yennefer, but he was also taking the opportunity to teach his students some key points. There were other famous doctors present, but none as renowned as Robert, who was at the center of the scene, with everyone discussing solutions based on his ideas. When Robert saw Lucian and Roxanne enter, he glanced at them and gestured for everyone to quiet down before walking up to Lucian. "Mr. Farwell, hello. Are you here to visit the patient?" Lucian's face was constantly appearing in the media, so it was no surprise that he was recognized. He decided to return Robert's show of courtesy and shook the man's hand. "Hello, I am Lucian Farwell. You must be Professor Zucker. It's an honor to meet you. We are relieved to have such a renowned doctor treating Mrs. Lon." Robert appreciated the compliment coming from someone of Lucian's status and nodded with a smile. Then, he turned to Roxanne and greeted her, Mrs. Farwell, hello." Roxanne was gradually getting used to the title and nodded in response. Lucian suddenly said, "Professor Zucker, it's quite a coincidence that my wife is also a famous doctor. She's here today to see if there's anything she can do to help Mrs. Lon." Robert politely replied, "I've heard of Dr. Jarvis' reputation, but I didn't expect her to be so young." However, his tone abruptly changed. Then again, Mrs. Lon's condition is related to psychology. I'm afraid Dr. Jarvis' expertise in pathology might not be of much help." Roxanne frowned slightly, sensing the hint of disdain in his words. Lucian also noticed and countered with a smile. That's not necessarily true. Some psychological conditions can indeed be treated through pathological methods. We're just trying out every method that might work, after all." Robert begrudgingly agreed, well, it's worth a try." Jones, who was nearby, sensed the tension and quickly introduced other psychologists to Lucian and Roxanne. He then led the couple into the room to visit Yennefer. After they entered, Robert's expression turned cold. "Roxanne Jarvis is a disciple of Harvey Lambert. What use can she be in treating this psychological illness? He had a history of grudges against Harvey, so naturally, he wouldn't warm up to Roxanne." Roxanne, however, was unaware of this. Then, she and Lucian saw Yennefer, who was asleep and looked haggard, with ghastly-looking scratches on her arms. The room was a mess, with shattered and broken items everywhere. Jones looked at his wife's pale face with concern and turned to Roxanne. Roxanne, I've heard that your skills in traditional medicine are extraordinary, especially acupuncture. That's why I asked James to invite you here. Go ahead and try your best. All right, I'll give it a try. I won't say more for now. Furthermore, we'll have to wait for Mrs. Lon's symptoms to flare up before we can know if the treatment is effective, Roxanne said calmly. As a doctor, it was crucial for her to maintain emotional composure. Yes, but she's bound for another fit. The sedative won't last long this time around. When that happens, you all need to be careful. She might not recognize anyone, Jones said with a worried expression.
Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.